I'm back. First of all, happy late new year. I'm really glad to be back here. For those who don't know me, my name is Daniel, I really love movies, and today I'm going to be ranking the entire Alien franchise. I'd say this, along with the Predator movies, were not the first, but the actual major horror franchises I was ever exposed to. I don't know if this was just me or any other early 2000s kids who grew up to be horror fans, but back in the glory days of cable, I guess you could say, AMC, FX, and Sci-Fi were the places to go. Not just for horror, but any movie needs really. Especially FX.
Movies. FX has the movies.
Agree. Because all of those channels were how I discovered both the Alien and Predator movies. Of course, I'll be covering both franchises back to back, but for now, what do I think of the Alien movies? Well, this is just my ranking, and I'd love for you to comment yours down below, but without further ado, here's mine. In ninth place is going to be Alien 3. So, I know I can be a lot kinder to the black sheep of horror franchises, and even though this is the lowest, this is no exception. Truthfully, I don't hate any of these movies, and considering my list, I don't think it would be fair. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just say this list is going to be very unconventional, and it has to do completely with the fact that I'm not the biggest fan of science fiction. Yes, this is sci-fi horror, but for the most part, not necessarily this one. A lot of these lean more into the science fiction of things. To be quite honest, because of that, I couldn't finish half of these in one sitting. All that being said, my notes on a lot of these are going to come very short. So, let's get started with my notes on this one. To get it out of the way, yes, this does commit a bad sequel sin by undoing a previous victory. A choice that I might be in the 1% of people that I commend them for. Could it have been more ceremonious? Absolutely. But I think, in this particular franchise, a choice like that kinda fits. Especially when it makes up for it by giving us a strong character arc for Ripley. A character arc that I think wouldn't have been effective if they didn't make that choice. Yes, I'm aware of all the behind the scenes drama, and I did watch the assembly cut by the way, and while I didn't feel much difference, one thing it has going for it regardless is a strong performance by Sigourney Weaver. With all that went on especially, I find it very commendable that she was still able to give it her all. They even made a bold choice with her character, per se, that they've tried with other horror final girls that typically never works. As far as the negatives of this movie, and you might have heard this all before, but yeah, this is not the most pleasant watch. The prison setting and its characters are one thing, but to barely try and make them characters worth rooting for just makes watching this kinda depressing. Or, as I would put it, cinematically depressing. If you don't know what I mean by that, it's a phrase I've created that I've mentioned in a few videos now. So, I'll just leave it down in my Daniel dictionary below. But anyways, yes, while I don't hate this movie, I'd be the least inclined to rewatch it. In 8th place is going to be Prometheus. To be fair, this one was almost my least favorite, but with how I just described Alien 3, it would not be fair. This is certainly a much lighter film, like by Stars or some other kind of space fun, I don't know. It's shot well, it's very ambitious, but ultimately, just not the story for me. First and foremost, this is the one that leans the most into science fiction, and the horror we do get doesn't really pay off all that well. And yes, it's very ambitious with the whole creation meeting creator themes, but even that doesn't pay off really well. Of course, you've heard that all before, so I'll give you a criticism that might sound very specific. This movie feels like this fancy remake of the original Alien that's extremely watered down. Not just because it leans the most into science fiction and has these broader themes, but most specifically, it has to do with the casting we got here. While none of them suck, I think the cast here is not just too recognizable, but also a little too pretty. Like I said, very specific, but it's a little too distracting in a sense. They just feel like pretty faces slapped into these roles that don't make these characters feel relatable or even like real people. And for what these movies are, where you have these characters either discovering things or being put in these dire situations, the cast shouldn't be all that overpowering. But for the most part, this story just doesn't work for me, and that fact doesn't make it any better. In 7th place is gonna be Alien Covenant. I kinda have the same gripes here as I do with Prometheus, in that this movie feels like another fancy remake of the original Alien. However, at least it delivers a lot more on the horror front. More importantly, we don't have a distracting cast this time, and it feels a lot more like an Alien film. I understand that people strongly dislike this one, but I don't get it, which might make this sound crazy, but as much as I don't like the science fiction elements, particularly the androids, I'd say that's one of my favorite aspects of this movie. With all I said about Prometheus, I'd say I never had a problem with Michael Fassbender as David. In fact, he actually kind of steals the show here. Maybe it's just me, but you can tell he had a lot of fun with what I think were some pretty bonkers directions they took for the androids in this one. Other than that, I really don't have much else to say. I did say some of my notes might come short, and this might be the shortest. I wouldn't call this so much middle of the road, but more like an average, easy background noise alien movie. Nothing more and nothing less. In sixth place is going to be Alien Romulus. The first Alien movie I ever watched in theaters. While it wasn't a terrible experience, it wasn't necessarily this big exciting one either, as I might have hoped. But that is by no means a bad thing. I'd say this one falls right in the middle for me. Still not in that middle of the road sense, but where I don't think it's the best since the original, but there's also little to nothing to dislike about it. I'd consider this the bridge movie. The movie that separates the ones I have more divided feelings about, and the ones that I have stronger or better feelings about. To me, this is very much the highlight reel of the franchise. A highlight reel elevated by the particular direction of Fede Alvarez. If there's anyone who knows how to make a good one, it's him. From his Evil Dead in 2013 to his Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2022, his style is unique in that he's a fan who embraces the entire fandom. While he doesn't usually take these massive swings, which I would have liked to see in this particular franchise, he still delivers. While this movie might not be all that, it still has plenty of its own going for it and absolutely works as a modern Alien movie. In fifth place is going to be Aliens. Alright guys, first of all, let's hold our fingers from the keyboard. This one is usually regarded as not just one of the best Alien movies, but one of the best movie sequels of all time. Does it deserve that title? Absolutely. Do I think it's overrated? No. Not really, at least. You know, I absolutely love James Cameron. He has never failed me. I mean, if we want to talk about sequels, Terminator 2 was one of my favorite movies, and one that defined my childhood. And this movie is no exception to being a big part of my childhood as well. In fact, this was my exposure to the franchise, and I still love this movie. However, as I got older, the nostalgia didn't fade, but some of the charm of this movie did. See, as a kid, I never watched this movie completely. I'd either just skip to the alien parts for this very early sense of thrill, or just have this on while I was playing with my toys. So when I finally sat down and watched this as an adult, giving it my full attention, it just couldn't keep it for the most part. And that's entirely because of how much more of an action movie this is. Not being a science fiction fan is one thing, but I'm much less of an action movie fan. While this movie still delivers on the horror and has some of the most iconic moments, again, not just of this franchise, but in movie history.
Get away from her, you bitch!
The action portion is just very overbearing for me, to a point where it's kind of excessive. Don't get me wrong, I can still enjoy a few shootings and explosions here and there, especially in this franchise, but I'm really just here for the horror. So, while this movie will always hold a special place in my heart, it's just not my favorite cup of coffee. But in fourth place is going to be Alien Resurrection. If you somehow decided to keep watching this video after my last pick, I hope this doesn't scare you off either. Plain and simple, this movie is that fun middle of the road installment that doesn't let up from start to finish. It's fast paced and strikes a really good balance between the science fiction, horror, and even the action elements. Even more, it's the first and probably only to lean a lot more into comedic elements that absolutely work for me. Especially at this point in the franchise, and even the 90s. Coming out in 1997, this movie almost feels like a product of the Scream era with how campy it is. That's probably because they had Joss Whedon on board, who's known for a lot, but who I know him most for, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Where that can be seen as Scream with vampires, this can be seen as Scream but with aliens. Well, before The Faculty came out, of course. With Scream being my favorite horror movie, this one's a lot more up my alley than some of the others. While the others might have stronger scripts, I just find this one to be more entertaining. I can just turn off my brain the most with this one. An even broader way this one stands out from the others is the fact that it probably has one of the best casts. Yes, like Prometheus, it does have some pretty big names here, but it's by no means all that distracting. In fact, some of the casting choices here add to the fun of this movie. We got Winona Ryder playing possibly one of my favorite androids, and even the voice of Chucky here, Brad Dourif. Of course, we got Sigourney Weaver back here too, and if she was a team player in Alien 3, she's an absolute champ here. She rolls with everything, and I love her for it. The biggest way I think this one stands out from the others though, of the original run anyway, is the fact that this is the first one to actually have a definitive and well-deserved happy ending. One that was only ever ruined by a retcon. All in all, this movie is pure 90s popcorn fun that I would absolutely classify as underrated. And speaking of, in third place is gonna be Alien vs. Predator Requiem. Now, at this point, I can absolutely hear and feel your rage from what I know is a boiling hot take. Yes, this one is usually lower, if not the lowest on people's lists. And yes, I can understand why, but really, I think people are way too hard on this movie, and I will absolutely defend it. This is not a guilty pleasure for me, but a proud pleasure, and I think this is going to be a rant. Giving you all the context, I watched this in the first movie for the first time, back to back. The same way I also rewatched both the first and this movie for this video in one sitting. With the good experience I had with the first movie, back to when I first watched it, watching this right after completed it. I'll get more into it when I talk about the first movie, but I have a lot of deep nostalgia for this one that puts it at this spot on the list. With this movie in general, I think I can ask, with how I've seen it described literally anywhere else, do you just want to hear the same things over and over again? To be honest, I don't really have any negatives for this movie, and the ones that people do have for it, I actually commend them for. I mean, yes, it's very dark, literally, as you can barely see a thing, but for the dark tone it went for, I think that look kind of fits. It does cross a lot of lines, like having a chestburster come out of a kid in the beginning, and having the pred alien impregnate a pregnant woman, but good for them. We need more horror movies that take risks like that, to be honest. And this movie came out in 2007, which kind of brings me to another point. It's not that the characters here are necessarily weak, it's that they're a bunch of stock characters. Stock characters that I think the writers had a lot of fun with, as if they were playing in a sandbox. No spoilers, but for example, there's a character in here who comes off as this very obvious horror stereotype that, let's just say, they go in a completely unexpected direction with. A direction which I commend them the most for. If you watch the movie, you'd know. But the point is, it gives this movie a brutal sense of realism in a way. Even more, it complements the small town setting, which is one of my favorite aspects of this movie. Not just because I grew up in one, so it's kind of relatable, or even the fact that, with how relentless this movie is, I still get some Disney Channel energy from it. It's because it aligns with the slasher vibes that I really love this movie for. Obviously, I'm a horror fan, but slasher movies are what I'd call my favorite cup of coffee. All that aside, this not only has some fun callbacks to both franchises, but also, on the Alien side of things, goes in a new direction or two. It's the first Alien movie not to take place in an isolated setting, and to me, deliver. But most of all, it gave us one of the most vicious xenomorph threats, the Pred Alien. That thing was a fucking monster that still kinda terrifies me, and I watched this for the first time at a pretty young age too. Well, the TV version, but still. I'd say this is certainly one of the scariest. One that people should also, to wrap up this rant, start coming more around to be honest. If you love this movie a lot like I do, come out of your shell and let me know. In second place is going to be the original Alien vs. Predator. If you couldn't tell, I have a very high regard for both of the AVP movies. They were the first I watched of either franchise that I actually sat down and paid attention to. And this is a recurring theme for me, but it's one of those movies that I walked in on as it was playing in the living room. That instance where you feel like a movie calls to you. Sounds dramatic, but this movie changed me in a lot of ways. Watching this as young as I was felt like this big level up for me, if you will. Long before I became aware of and fell in love with the more major horror franchises, this was like a building block. More so with the second movie, which yeah, I did watch back to back with this one, in what is a really good memory for me. I really can't say that I have many gripes with this one, to be honest. It does have a little bit of a slow burn, and is by no means a cinematic masterpiece, but nonetheless, a fun little adventure. There's not much I can say on the alien side of things, because, spoiler alert, I pull up for Predator, but they do their job. As far as what I think about the PG-13 rating, to be honest, I think it fits this movie. It's all about the brutality of predators fighting aliens, with humans just in the crossfire. Most of all, I'd say my love for this movie is also generational. In that same vein as Freddy vs. Jason, it's the reintroduction of both franchises for a new generation, my generation, that I'd be the first to recommend to a newcomer. It's an entry-level horror movie that happened to be my entry. But in first place, the original Alien. I just want to say that I watched this movie in its entirety many years after the only Alien movies I had seen were the AVP movies, and of course, all the childhood watching of Aliens. And somehow, it felt like discovering this world for the first time all over again, in a very bold way for me. To bring things full circle, I've kept telling y'all that I'm not the biggest fan of science fiction movies. And as much as this is one of my favorite horror movies, really, this isn't a horror movie. It's a science fiction movie that just happens to become a horror movie, and is all the more effective because of it. Not to mention, a movie that, in many ways, also quite literally, was way ahead of its time. The cinematography here looks very modern, and most of all, it gives us one of the first examples of a strong female lead or final girl, Ellen Ripley. Even though watching Aliens first gave it away that she survived, that first time she does is very nuanced, which is what makes her so strong, and her survival feel very earned. Do you guys hear that? The way all these characters are written here, and how they react to this very unexpected situation they're put in, really grounds this story as well. A story that I'll always consider, like everybody else, a true classic. And that was my ranking of the Alien franchise. Up next, I'll be ranking the Predator franchise. For now, I just want to say again that I'm very excited to be back in the YouTube groove after taking that small break to focus on screenwriting. Which, speaking of, I did get back into and took a few steps in a good direction in. While I'll still be focusing on that, I feel like getting back into this will not only give me a good balance, but also, more importantly, keep me going creatively. All that being said, I might not be as consistent as I was a few months ago, but I hope you'll stick along for the ride. Even more, I have also created a free Patreon. I did bring that up when I shared my acting reel. And yes, I do like to act too. Something else I'll be focusing on. But in case you missed it, my Patreon is where you can follow along as I either re-watch or discover these franchises before I rank them. I know I might still have a small audience, but I want to be as interactive as possible. Well, as always, this has been Daniel. Like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, keep loving movies.